The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Marcus Johnson's downtown law office, casting thin stripes of light across his polished mahogany desk. At 30 years old, Marcus had already made a name for himself as one of the city's most dedicated civil rights attorneys. His office walls told the story of his success, framed newspaper clippings, law degrees from prestigious universities, and photos of him shaking hands with community leaders. Marcus was reviewing case files when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Community Legal Aid. He picked up immediately, recognizing the number of his old friend and fellow attorney, James Thompson. "Marcus, we need your help." James's voice was tight with urgency. "Something's happening at the county courthouse, and it's worse than we thought." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, already reaching for his notepad. "Tell me everything, James." "It's Judge Crawford," James continued. "We've been tracking his sentencing patterns for the past year. Young black defendants in his courtroom are getting sentences 3 times harsher than anyone else for the same crimes. But that's not even the worst part." Marcus's pen paused mid-word. "What do you mean?" "We've had multiple reports from court observers and families. The judge. He makes comments. Racist comments. Mocks these kids right there in the courtroom. Last week, he told a 19-year-old boy that his kind would be better off learning to use a mop than wasting the court's time." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had heard rumors about Judge Harold Crawford before, but nothing this concrete. "Have any attorneys filed complaints?" "That's the problem," James sighed. "They've tried. But Crawford is smart. He's careful about what goes into the official record. Without solid evidence, it's his word against theirs. And you know how the Judicial Review Board works. They protect their own." Standing up, Marcus walked to his office window. From the 12th floor, you could see the courthouse dome rising above the city's skyline. That building was supposed to represent justice, but for too many people, it had become a place of prejudice and pain. "Send me everything you have," Marcus said. "The sentencing data, the complaints, witness statements, all of it. Already on its way to your email." "But Marcus," James paused. "We need more than just statistics this time. We need undeniable proof of his behavior. The kind that can't be explained away or buried in bureaucracy." Marcus watched a group of young men walking past the courthouse below. They looked about the same age as the defendants James had mentioned. How many of them would face Judge Crawford's prejudice? "I might have an idea," Marcus said slowly, his mind already forming a plan. "But I'll need to run it by Sarah first." Sarah Chen had been his law partner for 5 years. She was brilliant, ethical, and most importantly, she wasn't afraid to tell them when his ideas were crossing a line. He would need her perspective on this one. "Whatever you're thinking, be careful," James warned. "Crawford has friends in high places. If you move against him, you need to be absolutely sure you can prove everything." After ending the call, Marcus spent the next 2 hours going through the files James had sent. The pattern was clear in the data. Young black defendants consistently received maximum sentences for minor offenses, while others got probation or reduced charges for similar crimes. But numbers alone wouldn't be enough to stop Judge Crawford. Marcus pulled up his college photos on his computer. Even now, 10 years after graduation, people often mistook him for a student. With the right clothes and attitude, he could easily pass for 19 or 20. Beginnings of a plan started taking shape in his mind. His office door opened, and Sarah walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She took one look at his expression and raised an eyebrow. "I know that face, Marcus. That's your I'm about to do something either brilliant or crazy face." Marcus accepted the coffee with a slight smile. "Maybe both this time. We need to talk about Judge Crawford." As he began explaining his idea, Sarah's eyes widened. That's definitely crazy," she said finally. "But if we plan it carefully enough, it might just work." Marcus nodded, his determination growing stronger. Sometimes, he knew, you had to think outside the box to fight for justice. And Judge Crawford was about to learn that you can't judge a book by its cover, or a lawyer by his appearance. Sarah Chen paced back and forth in Marcus's office, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. It was late evening, and they had spent the last 3 hours planning their risky strategy to expose Judge Crawford's prejudice. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said, stopping to face Marcus. "You want to pretend to be a teenage defendant in Crawford's court. Do you understand how many laws this could break?" Marcus held up a folder. "Actually, I've been researching that. As long as I don't lie under oath or forge any documents, we're in a gray area. It's like undercover journalism. Sarah dropped into the chair across from his desk. Gray areas can still get you disbarred, Marcus. Or worse. Marcus opened his laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen was a photo of a young man named Kevin Thompson, who had received a 3-year sentence from Judge Crawford for stealing a bike. Next to it was a photo of a white teenager who had gotten only community service for the same offense. "This is why we have to do it," Marcus said quietly. "Traditional methods aren't working. We need to show everyone who Judge Crawford really is." Sarah studied the photos for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right. We need a perfect cover story." Over the next few hours, they created the character of Deshaun Williams. Marcus would play the role of a 19-year-old community college student charged with trespassing at an abandoned building. It was the kind of minor case Judge Crawford saw every week. "Your clothes need to be different," Sarah said, examining Marcus's expensive suit. "But not too different. We don't want to play into stereotypes." Marcus agreed. They went through his old college clothes and found some worn jeans, a plain t-shirt, and slightly scuffed sneakers. When he tried them on, he looked years younger. "Now for the hard part," Sarah said. "You need to change how you speak. Crawford needs to believe you're just another kid in his courtroom." They spent hours practicing. Marcus worked on changing his formal lawyer's vocabulary to simpler language. He studied videos of young people from the neighborhood where Deshaun supposedly lived, learning their speech patterns and mannerisms. "But we need more than just an act," Sarah reminded him. "We need evidence." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. "This looks like a normal pen. It will capture everything Crawford says, even if it's not in the official court record." Marcus picked up the pen, testing its weight. "Is it legal?" "In our state, yes. Single-party consent for recordings." Sarah smiled. "I did my research, too." They'd also prepared a backup plan. Sarah would be in the courtroom, pretending to be there for another case. If anything went wrong, she could step in. "What about the paperwork?" Marcus asked. "We need it to be perfect." Sarah pulled out another folder. "I talked to James at Legal Aid. He's helping us file the real trespassing charge under the name Deshaun Williams. Everything will be legitimate, just with you playing the role." As midnight approached, they reviewed their plan one final time. Marcus would arrive at court early next Monday, dressed as Deshaun. The case was scheduled for 10 a.m., one of several minor offenses on Judge Crawford's morning docket. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked one last time. "Once you walk into that courtroom, there's no turning back." Marcus stood and walked to the window. The courthouse was dark now, but in a few days, it would become the stage for their biggest gamble yet. "I'm sure," he said. "But there's one more thing we need to do." He turned back to Sarah. "We need to practice every possible scenario. Crawford might ask anything. Deshaun's background, his family, his school. I need to know this character so well that I can answer without hesitating." Sarah nodded and pulled out a notebook. "Okay, let's start from the beginning. Deshaun Williams, born August 15, 2004. They worked through the night, building a life story for Deshaun that would stand up to any questioning. As the sun began to rise over the city, Marcus felt ready. In just a few days, Judge Crawford would learn that appearances can be deceiving, and justice could come from unexpected places. Monday morning arrived with a mix of fog and nervous energy. Marcus arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m., dressed in his carefully chosen outfit. The worn jeans hung slightly loose, and the plain white t-shirt made him look younger than his 30 years. He had practiced his walk, not the confident stride of a lawyer, but the slightly uncertain steps of a teenager in trouble. The security guard barely glanced at him as he went through the metal detector. Marcus noticed how differently he was treated compared to when he wore his suits. No one held the door for him. A clerk pointed him toward courtroom 3 without looking up from her phone. Sarah was already inside, sitting in the back row with her laptop open, pretending to work on other cases. She didn't acknowledge Marcus when he entered. They had agreed to act like strangers. The recording pen felt heavy in his pocket. Other defendants filled the benches around him. Marcus observed their nervous habits, checking phones, bouncing legs, whispering to family members. He copied their body language, slumping slightly and fidgeting with his hands. At exactly 10 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. All rise, the Honorable Judge Harold Crawford presiding. Judge Crawford swept in, his black robes flowing behind him. He was tall and gray-haired, with sharp eyes that seemed to look down on everyone from behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He sat down and immediately began shuffling through papers, not bothering to look at the people waiting for their cases to be called. First case, he announced. Deshaun Williams, trespassing on private property. Marcus stood up, making sure to move with slight uncertainty. Here, sir. Your Honor. Judge Crawford finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Marcus. The corner of his mouth twitched with what looked like disapproval. Approach the podium, Mr. Williams, Crawford said, his tone already carrying a hint of condescension. Do you understand why you're here today? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus replied, carefully using the practiced voice of Deshaun. I was in that old building on Mason Street. Speak up, boy, Crawford interrupted sharply. This isn't some street corner conversation with your friends. From her seat, Sarah tensed slightly, but maintained her active disinterest. The recording pen in Marcus's pocket was capturing everything. Sorry, Your Honor, Marcus said louder. I was in the abandoned building on Mason Street. I shouldn't have been there. Judge Crawford leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. Well, at least you can form complete sentences. That's more than I usually get from young men like yourself. A few nervous laughs echoed from the gallery. Marcus noticed how some of the court staff looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up. Tell me, Mr. Williams, Crawford continued, what were you doing in that building? Looking for a place to sell drugs? Or maybe planning to steal what little copper wire is left? No, Your Honor, Marcus replied, letting a hint of genuine anger slip into his voice. I'm a student at the community college. I was just... A student? Crawford's laugh cut through the courtroom. And what might you be studying? Advanced loitering? Perhaps a master's degree in troublemaking? More uncomfortable laughter. Marcus saw Sarah's knuckles turn white as she gripped her pen. I'm studying pre-law, Your Honor. The judge's amusement grew wider. Pre-law? Now that is entertaining. Tell me, Mr. Williams, do you actually believe someone like you has any business in a courtroom, other than as a defendant, of course? Marcus forced himself to stay in character, though his blood boiled. Yes, sir, I believe anyone can. Spare me the social justice speech. Crawford waved his hand dismissively. I've been on this bench for 20 years. I know exactly where this is heading. Let me guess. Rough neighborhood, absent father, mother working multiple jobs. The recording pen captured every word, every laugh, every moment of prejudice. Marcus could feel the weight of it in his pocket, like a loaded gun aimed at Crawford's career. Your Honor, Marcus began again, but Crawford wasn't finished. Save it for your community college essays, son. This is a real courtroom, where actions have consequences. And I think it's time you learn some real consequences. Judge Crawford shuffled through the papers on his desk, his smirk growing wider with each passing moment. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other defendants watched nervously, seeing their own potential fate in how the judge treated Marcus. Now then, Mr. Williams, Crawford continued, emphasizing the name with mock politeness. Your file says this is your first offense. But we both know that's probably just because you haven't been caught before, don't we? Marcus felt his hands grip the podium tighter but maintained his role. No, Your Honor. I've never been in trouble before. I'm focusing on my studies and... Studies. Crawford laughed, cutting him off again. Let's talk about these supposed studies of yours. Pre-law, was it? He leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Tell me, can you even name the different types of law? From her seat, Sarah watched the exchange with growing anger. She could see other lawyers in the courtroom shifting uncomfortably, but none dared to intervene. The recording pen in Marcus's pocket continued its silent work. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, purposefully letting his voice shake slightly. There's criminal law, civil law, constitutional law. Well. Crawford's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. Someone's been reading Wikipedia. But let me save you some time and money, son. Learning to list legal terms doesn't make you a lawyer. Do you know what the LSAT is? Can you explain the rule against perpetuities? Marcus had to fight back a smile. He'd actually written a paper on the rule against perpetuities in law school. Instead, he lowered his eyes and mumbled, "No, Your Honor." Of course not. Crawford sat back, satisfied with himself. You see, this is the problem with your generation. You think watching a few episodes of Law and Order qualifies you to be a lawyer. Meanwhile, you're breaking into private property and wasting this court's valuable time. The judge picked up his gavel, tapping it idly. You know what I think would be more suitable for someone like you? Manual labor. Honest work with your hands. The law isn't for everyone, especially not for. He paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully for the court record, but his meaning was clear to everyone in the room. Especially not for people from your background. He finished with a thin smile. Marcus noticed a young black law clerk in the corner looking down at her shoes, her face burning with second-hand embarrassment and anger. The recording pen felt heavier in his pocket with each passing minute. Your Honor, Marcus started again. I know what I did was wrong, but I really am serious about my future. I'm maintaining a 3.8 GPA, and I'm working part-time to pay for my classes. A 3.8 GPA at a community college. Crawford scoffed. That's like being the tallest ant in the anthill. Do you know what kind of GPAs real law students have? From real schools? The judge turned to address the whole courtroom now, clearly enjoying his audience. This is what's wrong with our system today. We give these young men false hope, tell them they can be anything they want. Then they waste time and resources chasing impossible dreams instead of accepting their natural. He caught himself again, but the damage was done. Several people in the gallery were openly uncomfortable now. Sarah had her phone out under her desk, quietly recording video of the judge's behavior as backup. Well, Mr. Williams, Crawford continued, since you're so interested in the law, perhaps we should make this a learning experience. Let me teach you about maximum sentences for criminal trespassing. He flipped through his law book with theatrical flourish. According to our state statutes, I can give you up to 6 months in county jail. That would give you plenty of time to reconsider your career choices. Marcus felt his heart racing. The judge was about to cross a line that would make his prejudice undeniable. The recording pen was capturing every word, building an airtight case against Crawford's fitness for the bench. Unless, the judge added with false generosity, you'd like to tell me right now that you'll give up this lawyer nonsense and apply for some honest work instead. Maybe then we can talk about community service. The moment had arrived. Marcus knew Judge Crawford had given him everything he needed on the recording. The judge's smug smile, his obvious prejudice, and his abuse of power were all documented. Now it was time for the reveal. Actually, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice suddenly changing. The uncertain tone of Deshaun Williams disappeared, replaced by the confident, educated speech of attorney Marcus Johnson. I have a different suggestion. Crawford's smile faltered slightly at the change in Marcus's voice. Excuse me? Marcus straightened his posture, squaring his shoulders as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out his State Bar Association card and his law firm ID, placing them on the podium. My name is Marcus Johnson, Your Honor. I'm a licensed attorney and partner at Johnson & Chen Law Offices, and you've just provided an absolutely stunning demonstration of judicial misconduct. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Sarah quickly stood up, pulling out her phone to record the scene. The young law clerk's mouth dropped open, and even the bailiff took a step forward in surprise. Judge Crawford's face went from red to white in seconds. What? What is the meaning of this? The meaning, Your Honor, Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom, is that for months we've been receiving reports about your discriminatory behavior toward young black defendants. Today, you've proven those reports correct. Marcus pulled out the recording pen. Everything you've said in the last 30 minutes has been recorded. Every condescending remark, every prejudiced assumption, every abuse of your position, all of it documented. Crawford gripped his gavel so tight his knuckles turned white. This is outrageous. Bailiff, arrest this man for contempt. I wouldn't do that, Sarah called out, walking forward. She held up a thick folder. I'm Sarah Chen, Mr. Johnson's law partner. We've already filed complaints with the State Judicial Review Board, complete with statistical evidence of your sentencing disparities. This recording is just the final piece of evidence they needed. The bailiff hesitated, looking between the judge and the two attorneys. Other lawyers in the courtroom were pulling out their phones, recording everything. "You can't do this," Crawford sputtered. "This is entrapment. It's justice, Your Honor," Marcus said calmly. "Everything I told you was true. I did study pre-law. Then I went to law school, graduated with honors, and passed the bar exam. The only lie was pretending to be a teenager named Deshawn." He turned to address the packed courtroom. For years, young men have walked into this courtroom and faced prejudice instead of justice. They've been mocked, belittled, and sentenced harshly not because of their crimes, but because of their skin color and background. Crawford slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" But no one was listening to them anymore. The other defendants were standing up, some wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the judge's power crumble. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, his voice steady and strong, "you asked if I could explain the rule against perpetuities. Would you like me to do that now? Or shall we discuss the ethical canons that require judges to be fair and impartial?" The young law clerk was openly smiling now, and several attorneys in the gallery had moved closer to show their support for Marcus and Sarah. Crawford's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "This is a mockery of justice." "No, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "What you've been doing is the mockery of justice. What's happening right now? This is justice finally being served." He picked up his bar card and ID from the podium. "I believe we're finished here. The Judicial Review Board will be in touch very soon. And Judge Crawford, next time, maybe don't judge a book by its cover." The courtroom burst into applause as Marcus turned to leave. Sarah fell into step beside him, and together they walked toward the doors, leaving behind a stuttering, powerless Judge Crawford, who for the first time in his career had absolutely nothing to say. The hallway outside Courtroom 3 was chaos. News had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, and reporters were already rushing in with cameras and microphones. Marcus and Sarah stood calmly in the center of the storm, while Judge Crawford's angry voice could still be heard from inside the courtroom. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson," a young reporter pushed forward. "Is it true you went undercover to expose judicial discrimination?" Before Marcus could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. Judge Crawford stormed out, his face still purple with rage, his robes billowing behind him. Two court officers followed, looking uncertain about what to do. "You think this is over?" Crawford shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Marcus. "This was a setup, a conspiracy. I'll have your law license for this." Marcus turned to face him, his voice steady and clear. "Actually, Judge Crawford, let's talk about everything that's really over. Let's start with the statistics." Sarah opened her laptop, turning it to show the gathered crowd. In the past year alone, Judge Crawford sentenced young black defendants to jail terms 3 times longer than white defendants for the same crimes. We have the data right here. "Those numbers are meaningless," Crawford protested. "Every case is different." "Really?" Marcus pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. "Like Kevin Thompson, 19 years old, 3 years in prison for stealing a bike. And then there's Michael Brooks, 18 years old, white, same crime, same week, he got community service." The reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Camera flashes went off everywhere. The young law clerk from the courtroom had joined the crowd, recording everything on her phone. "You don't understand the complexities," Crawford started, but Marcus cut him off. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand how you called a 19-year-old honor student a thug last month. I understand how you told a young black pre-med student that he should learn to use a mop instead of wasting time with biology." More people were gathering now. Other judges peered out of their courtroom doors. Court staff stopped pretending to work and openly watched the confrontation. Those statements were taken out of context. Crawford's voice was getting higher, more desperate. Sarah stepped forward. "We have 27 sworn statements from defendants, lawyers, and court staff about your behavior. And now we have today's recording, where you clearly demonstrated your prejudice against someone you thought was just another young black defendant." "You tricked me," Crawford shouted. "No," Marcus replied calmly. "We simply gave you the opportunity to show who you really are, and you did that spectacularly well." A tall woman in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. "Judge Crawford, I'm Martha Reynolds from the State Judicial Review Board. We need to speak immediately." Crawford's face went from purple to pale. "Martha, this is all a misunderstanding." "Save it for the formal hearing, Harold," she said coldly. "My office has already received the recordings and documentation. The Chief Justice is waiting to speak with you." As Crawford was led away by Martha Reynolds, Marcus turned to address the gathered crowd and reporters. "For too long, prejudice has hidden behind a black robe and a gavel," he said clearly. "Today, that stops. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves fair treatment, regardless of their race, age, or background." Sarah added, "We're announcing the formation of the Equal Justice Initiative. We'll be monitoring courtrooms across the state, gathering data, and exposing any judge who shows this kind of bias." The young law clerk who had been in Crawford's courtroom stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've wanted to speak up so many times, but I was afraid." Marcus smiled gently. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Change is coming to this courthouse." As the reporters continued shouting questions, Marcus saw James Thompson, his friend from legal aid, pushing through the crowd with a broad smile. "You actually did it," James said, shaking his head in amazement. "You actually took down Judge Crawford." Marcus looked around at the chaos they had created, reporters scrambling for interviews, court staff sharing stories of Crawford's behavior, young defendants and their families finally feeling hope. "No," he replied. "We just showed everyone who he really was." He took himself down. 1 week after the courthouse confrontation, Marcus sat in his office watching the evening news. His face filled the TV screen as reporters covered what they now called the Crawford scandal. The story had gone national, sparking discussions about judicial bias across the country. In a shocking development, the news anchor announced, 12 more judges in 3 different states have been accused of similar discriminatory practices. The exposure of Judge Crawford's behavior has opened the floodgates, with defendants and attorneys coming forward with their own stories. Sarah walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Have you seen our email inbox? We've received over 1,000 messages since morning." Marcus took the coffee and nodded. "People who face Crawford in court, their cases need to be reviewed." "Not just Crawford's cases," Sarah said, sitting down. "We're getting stories about other judges too. People finally feel brave enough to speak up." Their office had become a hub of activity. In the conference room, volunteer lawyers were reviewing old case files. Law students were analyzing sentencing data. Civil rights organizations had sent representatives to help organize the growing movement. Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Kevin Thompson, the young man who had gotten 3 years for stealing a bike. "Judge Crawford's cases are being reviewed. My hearing is next week. Thank you for everything." "Look at this," Sarah said, turning her laptop around. On the screen was a video going viral on social media. It showed a young black woman standing up in another judge's courtroom, recording on her phone as she questioned the judge's unfair sentence. "She said she was inspired by what we did," Sarah explained. "People are starting to stand up for themselves." The office door opened, and James Thompson walked in with more files. "You two have started a revolution," he said, dropping the heavy stack on Marcus's desk. "The state Supreme Court just announced they're creating a special committee to investigate judicial bias." "Any word from Crawford?" Marcus asked. James grinned. "He's still suspended. The hearing is next month, but after that recording." He shook his head. "He's done. No way he keeps his position." On Marcus's desk, framed newspaper headlines told the story of the past week. "Judge exposed. Undercover lawyer reveals court bias. Crawford scandal sparks national debate. Supreme Court orders review of discriminatory sentencing. Thousands rally for judicial reform." Sarah turned up the TV volume as a news segment began. They were interviewing the young law clerk from Crawford's courtroom. "Working for him was terrible," she said on screen. "Every day, I watched him destroy young lives with his prejudice. But now," she smiled, "now I'm helping review his old cases. We're going to make things right." Marcus's phone rang again. It was Martha Reynolds from the Judicial Review Board. "Mr. Johnson," she said when he answered, "the board has finished reviewing your evidence. We found 342 cases where Crawford showed clear bias. We're recommending all of them be reopened." That's great news, Marcus replied, putting the phone on speaker so Sarah and James could hear. There's more, Martha continued. The Chief Justice wants to meet with you. He's creating a task force on judicial accountability, and he wants you to lead it. After the call ended, the three friends sat in stunned silence. Outside Marcus's office window, they could see protesters gathering in front of the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice reform. Remember when you said this was either brilliant or crazy? Sarah asked, smiling at Marcus. Turns out it was both, James laughed. Marcus walked to his window, watching the crowd below. A young black law student was giving a passionate speech about equal justice. Television cameras surrounded her, broadcasting her words to millions. We're not done, Marcus said firmly. Crawford was just the beginning. There are more judges out there like him, thinking they can hide their prejudice behind their power. So what's next? Sarah asked. Marcus turned back to his friends, determination in his eyes. Now we help others fight back. We teach them how to gather evidence, how to speak up, how to demand justice. And if the judges don't listen? James asked. Then they'll learn the same lesson Crawford did, Marcus replied. No one is above the law, especially not the people wearing the robes. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the podium in the largest courtroom of the state Supreme Court. The room was packed with reporters, lawyers, and citizens who had been affected by judicial bias. Today was the final hearing in the Crawford case, and the Chief Justice had invited Marcus to speak. Judge Crawford sat in the front row, looking much older than he had 6 months ago. His expensive suits had been replaced by a simple gray jacket, and his arrogant smile was long gone. Next to him sat his lawyer, who had already announced that Crawford would plead guilty to judicial misconduct. Your Honors, Marcus began, addressing the panel of Supreme Court justices. 6 months ago, I walked into a courtroom pretending to be someone else. Today, I stand before you as myself, but I represent thousands of voices that were silenced by prejudice in our courts. Sarah sat in the gallery with their team. Thanks to their work, over 500 of Crawford's cases had been reviewed. More than 300 defendants had their sentences reduced or convictions overturned. Kevin Thompson, the young man who had gotten 3 years for stealing a bike, was now free and attending college. The Crawford case wasn't about one judge, Marcus continued. It was about a system that allowed prejudice to hide behind authority. In the past 6 months, we've seen dramatic changes. He held up a thick report. 27 judges across our state have been investigated for bias. 15 have resigned. Over 2,000 cases are being reviewed. But most importantly, people are no longer afraid to speak up. The young law clerk who had worked for Crawford was now part of Marcus and Sarah's team. She sat with them, wearing a badge that read Judicial Accountability Task Force. Around the country, similar groups had formed, inspired by what happened in their courthouse. Judge Crawford will never sit on the bench again, Marcus said, looking directly at his former adversary. But this isn't about punishment. It's about change. Real, lasting change. Crawford stood up slowly. Your Honors, he said, his voice shaking slightly, I request permission to address the court. The Chief Justice nodded, and Crawford turned to face the crowded room. I was wrong, he said simply. For years, I told myself I was being tough but fair. I didn't want to see my own prejudice. It took Mr. Johnson's creative method to show me what I had become. He turned to Marcus. I've spent the past 6 months attending bias training, working with community organizations, and meeting with families I hurt through my unfair sentences. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can help prevent it from happening again. Marcus hadn't expected this. The old Crawford would never have admitted his mistakes. The Chief Justice spoke next. This court hereby accepts Judge Crawford's permanent resignation from the bench. Additionally, we are implementing new requirements for all judges in our state, regular bias training, monthly review of sentencing patterns, and a new system for reporting judicial misconduct. Sarah stood up. Your Honor, our organization has prepared a training program. We'd like to offer it to courts across the country. Approved, the Chief Justice said. And Mr. Johnson, the position of State Judicial Ethics Director remains open. Would you consider taking it? Marcus looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Thank you, Your Honor, but I believe I can do more good where I am. Our law firm is opening new offices in 5 cities. We're training lawyers to identify and challenge judicial bias. The real change happens in courtrooms, one case at a time. As the hearing ended, people gathered around Marcus and Sarah. Young lawyers asked to join their team. Community leaders wanted to start similar programs. Even some judges came forward, asking for help in examining their own biases. Outside the courthouse, Marcus saw a group of law students practicing their arguments. One of them was wearing a t-shirt that read "Justice sees no color." "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, watching them. "It all started because you decided to play a teenager in traffic court." Marcus smiled. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. We just have to be brave enough to take that first step." As they walked back to their office, Marcus saw his reflection in a window. He was still the same person who had walked into Crawford's courtroom 6 months ago, but everything else had changed, and this was just the beginning.